They called her a fool the day she signed her name to the deed, and perhaps, at 46 years old with $51 to her name and nowhere left to sleep, she was one. Nora Carver Whitfield had buried a husband, lost a farm, and watched the bank take the last of what she loved before a man named Silas Pruitt smiled at her from behind his oak desk and called it business. What remained to her fit into a single carpetbag and a coin purse that did not jingle so much as sigh. And so, when the auctioneer's gavel came down on the old abandoned train depot at Coldwater Junction, windows broken, roof sagging, weeds grown up through the platform boards, and no one else in that dusty crowd raised a hand, Nora raised hers, and bought the ruin for $46 and the promise to clear the taxes owed. The townsfolk laughed behind their gloves. They said she'd bought a coffin for her pride. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that somewhere above the old ticket window, behind a door that had not been opened in 32 years, something had been waiting, sealed away by a desperate hand, for exactly the kind of person foolish enough, and brave enough, to come looking. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Carver Whitfield. If you are watching this from a town the railroads forgot, or from a home that others have written off as worthless, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Nora had been born in that same town, in the spring of 1853, in a clapboard house 2 streets back from the depot where her father, Amos Carver, worked as freight agent and, in time, station master. Coldwater Junction in those years was not the withered thing it had become by the century's end. It was a proud little crossing of rail and river, a place where wheat came down from the northern farms to be weighed and loaded, where the whistle of the afternoon train meant mail from relations back east, bolts of new cloth, medicine for the sick, and news of the wider world arriving twice a day like clockwork. Amos Carver was known up and down that line as an honest man, the kind who counted every sack of grain twice and made the numbers balance before he'd let himself sleep, the kind who kept a Bible on the same shelf as his ledger books and consulted both with equal seriousness. It was from him that Nora learned the quiet discipline that would carry her through every hardship still to come, that a thing is not worthless merely because it looks worn, that a ledger kept honestly is a kind of prayer, and that patience, applied long enough to a problem, will usually find its answer. Her mother, Ruth, had died of the milk fever when Nora was only 9, leaving her the only woman in a house of men, her father and 2 older brothers who went off, in time, to work the cattle trails and never came home again, swallowed by the vastness of Texas and Nebraska and the silence that swallows so many young men in that era. So it fell to Nora, from a young age, to keep her father's house, to cook and mend and, increasingly, to sit beside him in the depot office on slow afternoons, learning to read the columns of his ledgers, to understand what a manifest meant, to recognize the particular scratch of his pen when he was troubled by a figure that would not add up properly. She had, even as a girl, what her father called an honest eye, a way of looking at a stack of numbers or a room of strangers and sensing, almost before she could explain why, when something was not as it seemed. It was a gift that would serve her cruelly little in the years of her marriage and her grief, and then, when she least expected it, would serve her everything. She married Thomas Whitfield at 19, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who farmed wheat and sorghum on 160 acres some 40 miles west, and for 26 years theirs had been a good marriage, not a grand one, full of small kindnesses, hard winters survived together, 2 children born and, in the way of that harsh country, one lost to diphtheria before her 3rd birthday, a grief that Nora carried silently for the rest of her days, tucked behind her ribs like a stone she had learned to walk around. Their son, Daniel, grew to manhood and moved to Denver to work the railway shops there, writing letters home dutifully but seldom able to send money, for a young man building his own life has little enough to spare. Thomas and Nora worked their land together, season after season, through drought years and flush years, through the grasshopper plague of '74 that stripped their fields bare in a single terrible afternoon and the good years after that slowly rebuilt what was lost. Through it all, Nora kept the farm's accounts in a ledger of her own, in the same careful, double-checked hand her father had taught her, and it was that habit, the honest eye, the refusal to let a number sit wrong on the page, that would matter more than anyone, least of all Nora, could have guessed. It was in the winter of 1897 that Thomas caught a chill mending fence in a late sleet storm, a a chill that settled into his lungs and would not leave, and by the time the ground thawed enough to bury him, Nora was a widow of 44 with a mortgage she had not known the full weight of until the bank's letters began arriving. Thomas, it turned out, had borrowed against the farm 3 years running to cover a run of bad harvests, hoping each spring to pay it back before Nora need worry over it, a kindness meant to spare her that had instead left her exposed, alone, and unaware, in the cruelest possible season, of just how much they owed. And the bank holding that note, as it happened, was the Coldwater Junction State Bank, presided over by a man named Silas Pruitt, whose family Nora's father had known, and not fondly, 30 years before. Silas Pruitt was, in the estimation of most who met him, a model of prosperity and civic virtue, a deacon of the church, a donor to the new schoolhouse, a man who shook hands firmly and remembered names. He was also, Nora would come to understand only much later, a man whose fortune had been built, brick by brick, upon foundations that would not bear close inspection. When Nora came to him in the spring of 1898, hat in hand, asking for 6 months' grace to bring in one more harvest and settle the debt honestly, Pruitt listened to her with an expression of grave sympathy, folded his hands upon his desk, and told her that business was business, that the bank had its own obligations, and that he was very sorry indeed but the foreclosure would proceed as scheduled. She stood in his office and watched him say it, and something in her, that same honest eye her father had given her, noted, without her quite knowing why, that his sorrow did not reach his eyes, that his hands upon the desk were too still, too composed, like a man reciting words he had said many times before to many women exactly like her. She left with nothing but her signature witnessed on the surrender papers and a feeling she could not yet name. Within the month the farm was sold at auction to a cattle syndicate out of Wichita, the furniture and tools scattered to neighbors for whatever they'd bring, and Nora Whitfield found herself, at 46, riding east on a hired wagon with a carpetbag, $51, and no clear notion of where a woman alone was meant to go. She thought, in her grief and her drifting, of the town of her girlhood, of Coldwater Junction, where she had not set foot in nearly 3 decades, not since the year her father had been disgraced and the family had fled in shame, for that, too, was a wound she carried, older even than the loss of her daughter or her husband, a wound she had never spoken of to anyone, not even Thomas. She did not go back with any plan of settling there. She went back, if she was honest with herself, because a person in deep enough grief will often return to the last place she remembers feeling safe, the way a wounded animal returns to its den, whether or not the den still stands. What she found when the wagon rolled into Coldwater Junction in the autumn of 1899 was a town half its former size, its main street gone quiet, its grain elevator standing dark, for the railroad had long since rerouted its main line 11 miles south to a larger town called Marsh Falls, leaving Coldwater Junction to wither on its old spur like a branch cut off from the trunk. The depot itself, the very building where her father had once kept his careful ledgers, where she had learned to read a column of figures at his knee, stood at the edge of town with its windows shattered, its platform buckled, its sign faded nearly to illegibility, a monument to everything the town had lost. And it was there, at the courthouse steps 2 days after her arrival, that Nora learned the depot and its half-acre were to be sold that very afternoon for back taxes, the county having no further use for a building that served no trains at all. She told herself, standing in that thin crowd of onlookers, that she was merely curious, that a woman with $51 had no business bidding on anything. But when the auctioneer opened the bidding and no one, not a single soul in that town who remembered her father's name and the shame attached to it, offered so much as $1, something rose in Nora that she could not entirely explain even to herself, some stubborn loyalty to a building that had once been the proudest place in her small girlhood world. And before she had quite decided to do it, her hand was in the air, and the number that came out of her mouth was $46, every cent she could spare and still eat that winter. The gavel fell. The crowd murmured. An older woman near her sniffed and said, just loud enough to be heard, that the Carver girl had come home to buy herself a coffin, and several others laughed, not unkindly exactly, but with the particular cruelty of people who have decided a thing is settled and are relieved to have someone to feel superior to. Nora said nothing. She had learned, over 46 years, that dignity is often best defended with silence. She spent her first days as owner of the depot simply sweeping out 3 decades of dust and pigeon droppings and broken glass, sweeping until her hands blistered and her back ached, sleeping at night on a cot she'd borrowed from a sympathetic widow named Mrs. Agatha Pell, who ran the boarding house and who alone in that town seemed to look at Nora without judgment. It was on the 4th day, while clearing the rubbish from the old ticket office, that Nora's broom struck something solid beneath a fallen shelf, and she knelt to find a small brass key, green with age, tied with a scrap of ribbon so rotted it crumbled at her touch, tucked into a gap in the floorboards as though someone, long ago, had hidden it there in haste. She turned it over in her palm and felt, without knowing why, her heart begin to beat faster, for she remembered, dimly, the way one remembers the furniture of a house left in childhood, that her father had kept a private office above the ticket room, a narrow room reached by a back stair, its door always locked, its key always on his person, a room she had been forbidden, gently but firmly, ever to enter. She climbed the back stair that same afternoon, her lamp throwing long shadows up the narrow walls, and found the door exactly where memory placed it, its brass lock tarnished nearly black but its frame still solid, oak that 30 years of weather had not managed to warp. Her hand trembled as she fitted the key. It turned with a groan of old metal, stiff but not broken, as though it had been waiting, patiently, for precisely this moment. The door swung inward on hinges that shrieked once and then went still, and Nora stood on the threshold of a room that had not felt a living breath since 1867, dust hanging thick in the lamplight like a curtain she was about to part. The room was small, no more than 8 feet square, containing a roll-top desk, a single ladder-back chair, and a narrow iron safe standing in the corner with its door ajar, empty, long since looted by whoever had first broken into the depot in the years after its closing. But it was the desk that drew her, its roll-top still down, its brass fittings dulled but intact, and when she lifted the cover it came up with a soft complaint, revealing pigeonholes stuffed with yellowed papers, a dried inkwell, a blotter gone brittle and brown. And there, in the very center of the desk, weighted down by a smooth gray river stone, was a single sealed envelope, and upon it, in a hand Nora would have known anywhere, in ink faded to the color of weak tea, were the words, "To whoever finds this room again, read the ledger first, then judge me." Her hands shook as she broke the seal. Inside was a short letter in her father's hand, dated the 14th of March, 1867, 3 days, she would later calculate, before he was dismissed from his post and the family fled Coldwater Junction in disgrace. The letter said that he had discovered, in reviewing the accounts of the newly formed Coldwater Farmers Cooperative, an organization he himself had helped found, through which the small wheat farmers of the district pooled their harvest money to purchase seed, equipment, and rail shipping rights at a fair collective price, a discrepancy of some $1,200, a sum representing nearly the whole of that year's cooperative fund, gone from the account book that he alone, as depot agent, was charged with reconciling against the bank's records. He had gone, the letter said, to the young cashier who handled the cooperative's account at the bank, a rising clerk named Silas Pruitt, to ask him to explain the discrepancy, and within a week it was Amos Carver himself who stood accused of the theft, his own careful ledgers twisted and reinterpreted by men more powerful than he to prove exactly the opposite of what he knew to be true. He had, the letter explained, managed in the chaos of those final days to recover a portion of the missing sum, how, he did not say, only that it had come to him through means he was not proud of but did not regret, and rather than let it vanish entirely into whatever pocket had already swallowed the rest, he had hidden it here, behind this locked door, along with the true accounts, the ones that had not been doctored, praying that someday, somehow, an honest hand would find them and finish what he had not lived long enough to finish himself. He had died, the letter said nothing more of, only that he loved his daughter and hoped, wherever life carried her, that she would remember that a Carver's word was worth more than any man's opinion of it. Nora sat on the floor of that dusty room for a long while after reading it, the lamp burning low, tears she had not expected coming quiet and steady down her face, not only for the grief of a shame she now understood had never belonged to her family at all, but for the strange, aching mercy of it, that her father, disgraced and dying, had thought first not of vengeance but of the town he loved, and had left this room sealed like a message in a bottle, waiting 3 decades for the tide to bring the right hands to open it. Beneath the desk, in a compartment she found only by running her fingers along its underside as her father's letter instructed, was a small iron strongbox, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, lay a stack of double-eagle gold coins, not the full $1,200, but $800 and some odd dollars in gold, a fortune to a woman who had arrived in town with 51, alongside a second, thinner ledger, its pages filled with her father's meticulous hand, showing, month by month, precisely where the cooperative's money had gone, not into farmer seed and shipping as it should have, but into a series of private land purchases made, quietly, under names that did not at first mean anything to Nora until she recognized among them the maiden name of Silas Pruitt's own wife, and beneath that, in her father's careful annotation, the true owner behind every transaction, S. Pruitt. She did not sleep at all that night. She sat instead at her father's desk with his ledger open before her by lamplight, cross-referencing dates and figures the way he had taught her, feeling, for the first time since Thomas had died, something other than grief moving through her, something that felt, unfamiliar as it was, almost like purpose. But she understood, even in that first flush of vindication, that a dead man's ledger and a box of old coins would not by themselves undo 30 years of a false story, not in a town that had already decided, long before she arrived, exactly who the Carvers were and what they had done. She would need more than proof. She would need patience, and she would need, as her father always had, to be very sure of every figure before she let herself speak. Word travels fast in a small town even when the town itself is dying, and it was not many days before it became known, first as rumor, then as fact confirmed by Mrs. Pell, who had heard it from the county clerk, that the Carver woman had found something up in that old depot, something she'd taken to poring over by lamplight every night, something that had put a strange new light in her eye. Silas Pruitt, now 61 years old, silver-haired and still every inch the picture of respectability in his black frock coat, was not a man who had survived 30 years at the top of a small town's hierarchy by ignoring rumors, and it was he himself who came calling at the depot one gray October afternoon, his buggy pulled up smart at the platform, his manner warm and avuncular as he inquired after Nora's welfare and offered, with every appearance of neighborly concern, to buy the depot property back from her at twice what she'd paid, on account of it being, as he put it, no fit place for a lady alone. Nora received him in the swept-out ticket office, offered him nothing to sit on but the single chair she owned, and watched him with her father's old patient stillness while he made his offer, and when she declined it, politely but without hesitation, she saw for just a moment the composure crack behind his eyes, the same flicker of something cold and calculating she had glimpsed once before in his bank office. The year he foreclosed on her farm without ever once feeling, she now understood the smallest true regret. He left with his smile still fixed in place, but the visit had told her what she needed to know. He was afraid of what she had found, and a frightened man, her father had once told her, watching her sort figures at his knee, is a man who will make mistakes. In the weeks that followed, Pruitt did not sit idle. He spoke quietly to certain men in town, men who owed him money on notes he could call due whenever it suited him, men who ran the general store and the feed lot and sat on the town council, and soon a petition began circulating, respectfully worded but unmistakable in its intent, suggesting that the derelict depot, being an eyesore and a fire hazard and now, worse, the residence of an unmarried woman of uncertain character, ought to be condemned by the town council and its owner compensated. A fair but modest sum for its removal. Nora heard of the petition from Mrs. Pell before it ever reached her officially, and heard too, with a pain she had not expected, that several of the names upon it belonged to farmers whose fathers her own father had once helped organize into that same cooperative, families who did not know, could not know, what had truly become of their money 30 years before, and who had simply absorbed, over 3 decades, the story Silas Pruitt's version of events had left them, that Amos Carver was a thief who had ruined the cooperative and fled in shame, and that his daughter, returning now with strange midnight habits and a locked room full of secrets, was perhaps cut from the same cloth. It would have been easy, in that moment, for Nora to feel that the whole of the town had turned against her the way it had once turned against her father, and there were nights, alone in the depot with the wind working at the broken windows, when the old grief and the new grief braided together into something very close to despair. But she thought of her father's letter, of the words "judge me only after you read the ledger," and she understood that what her father had failed to do, not from lack of courage but from lack of time, was to bring his proof before the very people who most needed to see it, plainly, before they were asked to take anyone's word for anything. And so, rather than confront Silas Pruitt directly, rather than hide the ledger away in fear of losing it, Nora spent 3 careful weeks doing what her father had done in every honest year of his working life. She built her case in numbers, cross-referencing the old cooperative ledger against county land records at the courthouse, against the bank's own public filings, against the memories of the 2 or 3 elderly farmers still living who had been founding members of the cooperative and who, once she gently prompted their recollections, remembered more than they realized they knew: a shipment of seed that never arrived though it had been paid for, a rail rebate that vanished the same season Amos Carver was dismissed, a young cashier's sudden, unexplained purchase of prime river bottom land the very year the cooperative fund came up short. She called a meeting, in the end, not through any dramatic gesture but through the plainest and most public means available to her. She asked the Reverend Elias Dunmore, who preached at the Coldwater Junction Church and who had known both her father and, in his youth, young Silas Pruitt, to open the church hall on a Sunday evening for what she described simply as an accounting she wished to lay before the town regarding the old farmers' cooperative, an accounting that concerned money some of their own fathers and grandfathers had once contributed and never seen the good of. Curiosity, in a town starved for anything resembling news, filled the hall past its benches, and Silas Pruitt himself came, as she had known he would, seating himself near the back with his composure carefully arranged, unwilling to let it be said he had feared to face her. Nora stood at the front of that hall in her plainest good dress, her father's 2 ledgers open on the lectern before her, and she did not raise her voice, did not accuse, did not once look directly at Pruitt as she spoke, for she had learned, watching him twice now, that a calm accounting unsettled him far more than any show of anger could. She read the figures plainly, dated entry against dated entry, showing the town precisely what had been paid into the cooperative in the spring of 1867, and precisely where, according to her father's careful cross-referencing, that money had actually gone, not lost, not stolen by the man who had been blamed and driven from town in shame, but quietly, patiently redirected, over a period of months, into land purchases that had, in the 3 decades since, become the foundation of Silas Pruitt's considerable fortune. She read her father's letter last, his own words, his own hand, explaining what he had found and why he had hidden the proof rather than let it be destroyed along with him, and by the time she finished there was a silence in that church hall so complete that Nora could hear the lamps hissing on the walls. It was old Ezra Talbot, 90 years old and one of the last living founders of the cooperative, who broke that silence, rising slowly on his cane to say, in a voice thickened by age and old grief, that he remembered now, remembered it clear as yesterday, the season his own wheat money went missing and how ashamed he'd felt believing Carver had taken it, how he'd never once, in 30 years, thought to wonder why a man so careful with figures his whole life would suddenly turn thief the very season a young bank clerk began buying up river bottomland he had no business affording. Others rose after him, memory loosening memory the way it does in a room where the truth has finally been given permission to surface, and Nora watched Silas Pruitt's face in the lamplight, watched the color drain slowly from it as 30 years of careful reputation came undone not through anger or accusation but through simple, patient arithmetic laid plainly before people who had, in the end, only ever wanted to know what was true. Pruitt did not shout, did not deny it outright, for a man of his particular cunning knew there was nothing left to deny before a room already turning against him. He rose instead with what dignity he could still muster, said something about the lateness of the hour, and left the hall to a silence that followed him out into the dark like a verdict. Justice, in Coldwater Junction, did not come in the form of handcuffs or a judge's gavel, for the statute of years and the difficulty of the courts made a criminal conviction, all agreed, an unlikely and lengthy road. It came instead in quieter, surer ways, the ways a small town has always disciplined its own, the bank's board of directors, several of them men who had signed that same petition against Nora weeks before and now felt the sting of shame for it, quietly requested Pruitt's resignation within the month. The river bottom lands he had built his fortune upon were revealed, on closer county inspection. to carry liens and irregularities enough that a fair portion of them reverted, through legal settlement, to the very cooperative whose money had purchased them in the first place, and Silas Pruitt, stripped of his bank office and his deacon's seat and, worst of all to a man like him, of the town's good opinion, lived out his remaining years a diminished figure, greeted with careful politeness and nothing warmer, which was, perhaps, its own particular sentence for a man who had spent his whole life curating the world's admiration. With the recovered cooperative funds, the reclaimed land, and the $800 in gold her father had hidden away, Nora did not build herself a grand house or leave Coldwater Junction for some easier life, though she might have. Instead she called another meeting, this one joyful rather than solemn, and proposed to the town what she had been turning over in her mind through every one of those long lamplit nights above the ticket office, that the money be used to revive the old farmers' cooperative properly, this time under public oversight and open books for any member to inspect, to repair the grain elevator and reopen a spur agreement with the rail company at Marsh Falls, and to restore the depot itself, her depot, her father's depot, as the cooperative's headquarters and the town's freight office once more, a working building instead of a monument to grief. The town, humbled and grateful in roughly equal measure, agreed without much debate, and through that winter and the following spring Coldwater Junction did something it had not done in 30 years, it grew, a little, the platform mended, the grain cars rolling again, children playing on ground that had lain silent since before their parents were born. And so it was that Nora Carver Whitfield, who had arrived in that town with $51 and a name she believed disgraced, came in time to be known simply as Mrs. Whitfield of the depot, a woman townsfolk stopped their wagons to greet, a woman whose father's name was spoken again, at last, without the shadow that had followed it for 30 years. She kept her father's ledgers, both the false story and the true one, locked now not out of shame but out of reverence, in the same roll-top desk where she had found them, and she often told visitors to the depot office, for it became, in time, something of a gathering place, farmers stopping to talk business and children stopping simply to hear her tell of the old days, that the most valuable thing she had ever owned had cost her $46 and had looked, to every soul in town but her, like nothing worth having at all. That, in the end, is the whole of what happened to the woman they once called a fool for buying a ruin nobody else would touch, and it seems to us a story worth remembering precisely because it began with so little and so much doubt. Nora Carver Whitfield lost a husband, a farm, and very nearly her good name, and she rebuilt not by wanting more than her share but by insisting, patiently and without bitterness, that the truth be allowed its proper weight. She did not seek the gold for herself, though she had every right to it. She did not seek revenge on the man who wronged her father and her, though she had every reason to. She sought only to finish the accounting her father had begun and never lived to close, and in doing so she restored not only her own name but the whole small, struggling town that had once turned its back on her family. It is, we think, the oldest kind of justice there is, not loud, not swift, but certain, arriving in its own good time to those patient enough, and honest enough, to wait for it. Thank you for spending this evening with us and with Nora's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that worth is not always visible at first glance, and that patience and honesty, however unfashionable they may seem, still count for something in this world. We'd love to know, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off, an old house, a forgotten skill, a person no one believed in? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing where our stories find you. Until next time, stay close.